So this slide is on oogenesis, the production of the female gamete. So remember, it's a type of gametogenesis, and it's quite different in the female. And it all begins in the fetal period. So during the fetal period, there are oogonia. And when something ends with gonia, so like, for example, spermatogonia, those are diploid stem cells. They're going to divide by mitosis first, and that product enters into meiosis. So it begins as a primary oocyte that undergoes meiosis 1, and that primary oocyte, remember, is diploid. So meiosis 1 produces a secondary oocyte, which is then haploid. So some of the key differences here between oogenesis and spermatogenesis is that the production of the primary oocyte occurs only in the fetus. In males, sperm production doesn't begin until puberty. Also, the primary oocyte, the meiosis actually pauses, is arrested at late prophase 1. And that's a very important part because late prophase 1, as you recall from the meiosis videos, is going to increase genetic variability. In the secondary oocyte, which is haploid, the meiosis also is arrested too. It pauses. That might be a better word than arrested, but it pauses at metaphase 2, and it only is completed if fertilization occurs. So if there's never fertilization that occurs, then that secondary oocyte ends up being lost in the menstrual blood for the next monthly period. So at birth, the female has her lifetime supply of primary oocytes. So our relationship between the oocytes and the follicles is shown here. We've talked a little bit about that. You saw this on an earlier slide. But there is the ovarian follicle, which is that functional unit of the ovary that encloses a single oocyte. And it's surrounded by different types of cells. One type of cell is the pregranulosa cell, if only one layer is present. But if there's more, we call them granulosa cells. The follicles, then they go through different stages of development, starting with a primordial follicle. And the primordial follicle is pregranulosa cells surrounding a primary oocyte, which is diploid. The primary follicle is now going to have cuboidal shaped pregranulosa cells instead of squamous shells. So we kind of go from these flat cells here to these cube-like shaped structures. The primary follicle also surrounds the primary oocyte, which is also diploid. Then there is a secondary follicle. This happens as there's multiple layers of granulosa cells still surrounding a primary oocyte, which is diploid. Then finally, we have a vesicular or antral follicle, also called a tertiary follicle. It's called this because there's a fluid-filled cavity called an antrum. And this is what's present before ovulation. And it resumes meiosis and becomes the secondary oocyte. So remember that it was paused in prophase 1 for the primary oocyte. Then in the vesicular follicle, this is where it completes meiosis 1 to become the secondary oocyte. Our next slide shows the events that happen in the follicle. So on the left-hand side of your screen is the follicular development. On the right side of your screen would be the meiosis events. So the right side of the screen would be showing oogenesis. We have the meiosis events and the follicular events. So let's put both of those together. So before birth, there are primordial follicles that are already present at birth, and they contain the primary oocytes that are arrested in prophase 1. So there's the primary follicle with the oocyte inside of it, and that oocyte is a primary oocyte, which is diploid. And before that, the stem cell was called an oogonium before mitosis occurred. So after um, after birth, this is when the primordial follicles are going to start to mature. So the primary, and secondary follicles all contain primary oocytes that are arrested at prophase 1. So it's important to remember. So they're all primary oocytes, but the follicle gets a little bigger. So the follicle is simply named because of the shape of the granulosa cells and the layers of granulosa cells. So now from puberty to menopause, each month there is going to be one follicle that is rescued from atresia each month, and that primary oocyte is going to be housed by the dominant follicle. So atresia means programmed cell death, basically. So this is the dominant follicle here. So the meiosis 1 um, has been completed, and that secondary oocyte is what's going to be ovulated. And as you know, as long as you see secondary, you know that it has to be haploid. Now, that secondary oocyte is paused, it's arrested in metaphase 2. So, this is where it does not complete meiosis 2 unless ovulation happens. So, in this case, if fertilization happens, this was the ovulation happening here. But if fertilization happens, if the sperm is able to fertilize that egg, that is when it completes meiosis 2, because it was paused, remember, in metaphase 2. So the relationship between the oocytes and the follicles are shown on this slide. The oogenesis begins during the fetal period. The primordial follicles um, first are the first to develop in the fetus. The primary oocytes are arrested at prophase 1. Only a small fraction is recruited into a pool. The follicles have two fates. The large majority of them are going to be destroyed, which is through what's called apoptosis, programmed cell death. The remainder of them, some will ovulate. So each month at puberty, there are a select few primary oocytes that are activated. But there's only one that will end up being ovulated as a secondary oocyte. That's because it's selected each month as the dominant follicle. And it's caused by high hormonal levels, especially FSH, which we're going to look at later in the chapter. So the products of meiosis are shown here. The dominant follicle resumes meiosis 1 just before ovulation. After the division of meiosis 1, there are two haploid cells, a first polar body, a secondary oocyte, and the secondary oocyte arrests in metaphase 2, and it's not complete. It doesn't complete meiosis 2 unless there's penetration by the sperm. Then it quickly completes meiosis 2 to yield an ovum and a secondary polar body. But if it's not penetrated by the sperm, that oocyte is going to degenerate.